Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin, bringing you stories of capitalism. The wine industry braces for another round of tariffs on imports to the United States. Why being a domestic producer won't necessarily help. And artificial intelligence could change the fundamentals of our economy and give central banks new tools to monitor and manage it. Plus, the growing business of wellness wearables and whether they really can help us live longer, healthier lives. But we start with the profound changes President Trump is bringing, or promising to bring, to us all. From the one big beautiful bill to more tariffs he says are only days away. We welcome back our special contributor, Larry Summers, to tell us what is likely to have long-lasting effects.
David, it has to be recognized that it's a big legislative accomplishment. It's a larger bill, passed sooner than other presidents have achieved. But I don't think it's going to take the country in the right direction. I think it's going to grow our budget deficits in the future very substantially, and you're already seeing some market reaction to that. And I think that what it does to our social safety net is really going to be devastating relative to the path the country would have been on. If you look at cutbacks in the social safety net, there were cutbacks in the welfare reform bill that was passed during Bill Clinton's presidency. There were cutbacks made by President Reagan in his original tax and budget legislation. This is the largest cutback in the social safety net that anybody has been able to find. And it's coming at a time when we appear to be on a trajectory to massive cutbacks in spending on scientific research, massive cutbacks in support for the arts and humanities, maximum cutbacks in support for foreign assistance programs, including ones on which large numbers of AIDS patients in Africa are dependent for their life-saving medicines. So this is legislation that, to my mind, both compromises our capacity to defend ourselves as a country because of all of the debt, and frankly, compromises what makes our country worth defending in terms of being a humane force in terms of the world, in terms of our sense of national community and protecting everybody, in terms of some of our greatest contributions to humanity in both the sciences and the arts. And so I think this is a very troubling piece of legislation in ways that go beyond the problematic immediate economics.
This one big beautiful bill is one part of a more sweeping plan that President Trump has for, I think it's fair to say, really redoing the American economy. And yet we don't see much reaction yet from the economy in the numbers. And I'll give you an example in the tariffs. A lot of talk about tariffs, a lot of fear about tariffs. And yet if you look at the CPI numbers, the PPI numbers that are coming out, they don't indicate the inflation that most economists predicted.
I think it's early days. It may be that there are a set of other developments going on through artificial intelligence, through technology that are exerting a deflationary force. It may be that people, given all the huge uncertainties about tariffs, are waiting to see how it shakes out before they establish their new price structures. It may be that for a time, it's possible for the people in the middle to eat the tariff increases in order to try to get market share. I agree with you, David. I would have expected more inflation, and what you always have to do as an economist is watch the data and be prepared to change your mind. But for now, I think that I wouldn't want to rush to a judgment that these tariffs are innocuous for inflation. I think the more likely thing is that they're going to be somewhat more delayed in their impact. Certainly, there have been many careful studies that compared the sectors that were tariffed and the sectors that were not tariffed during the president's first term, and found that tariffs did translate into higher prices. So I would rather wait and see on this. I think that's the approach that the Federal Reserve is taking, and I think, frankly, that is the right approach.
I mean, we've really seen a move up in the 30-year yield. We're above 5% relatively constantly now. There are some who are concerned about exactly what that's telling us about inflation expectations and term premium.
David, I look at the 10-year market relative to the 20-year or 30-year market as a sign of where the markets see very long-term rates going over the very long term, what market participants call the forward rate. And we now have forward rates on regular bonds that are well above 5%, and forward rates on TIPS, on bonds linked to inflation, that are well above 3%. And those are ominous indicators about our nation's credibility over the medium term. They're ominous indicators with respect to the government's ability to issue long-term debt. They're ominous indicators with respect to the deficit, because if you look at the projections people quote from the Congressional Budget Office, from other places, they're building in much lower interest rate assumptions. So I think if you look at what's happened to bond markets, if you look at what's happened to the dollar, you have to view our nation's fiscal situation with considerable trepidation and concern.
While the government grapples with all that debt it's taking on, consumers and small businesses have their own responses to Trump administration policies, as Bank of America Chairman and CEO Brian Moynihan explained.
So if you look on the consumer side, in our 70 million consumers who engage with the economy every day, and they send through their accounts and spend the cash and everything, about $5 trillion a year. That grew up 4% plus the second quarter 25 or the second quarter 24. So they, because they're employed and because wage growth, and that's not every single consumer, but in the main, they are continuing to grow and spend more, and that helps the economy. And so you're seeing in some of the moderate income households, there's a little bit of moving around to different things. You're seeing people trade from one thing to another, less planes, more cruises earlier. That's leveling out now. A lot more going to movies because the movies are good. But at the end of the day, they're spending discretionary necessary at about the same percentage they traditionally spent. They've got money in their accounts. They're employed, and the wage growth has been relatively strong, and so they're in pretty good shape. The credit quality is good. They have equity in their homes. They're low rate financing in the mortgage, so consumers pretty good. When you go to small businesses, that's more the question, small, medium-sized businesses, because the interest rate environment hits them harder because they borrow on lines of credit short-term for a lot of their activities, and that rate went up substantially. And then you think about if I'm a $100 million company, a $50 million company here in North Carolina, and I'm engaging in the world finance, I'm importing goods and manufacturing them, further manufacturing them, selling them. It got pretty interesting here trying to figure out all the trade and tariffs. So I think the certainty on the tax rate helps them, meaning the big, beautiful bill passing and the tax rate. That's a very good thing. The alternative would not have been good if their tax rates would have changed. a satisfactory resolution to the trade so that they could learn the rules of the road over the next 30, 60, 90 days and get their plans for next year put together. And I think ultimately we're going to have a satisfactory resolution on immigration and population growth, because at the end of the day, what I'm hearing more from construction companies, farming companies, and travel and entertainment type companies is I'm starting to struggle with labor availability at any price. And that's not that we got to make sure they have the workers, because they will supply a great service economy will continue to grow.
Up next, we've been hearing about those tariffs coming our way since President Trump returned to office. But where will it really affect us in our daily lives? It turns out that those of us who drink wine could be on the front lines.
Where are you going to find champagne? Where are you going to find Chateauneuf du Pape? Where are you going to find Chianti? You're not going to find it in Oregon or California.
This is a story about bottled poetry. That's what Robert Louis Stevenson called wine, and it's something that many of us enjoy regularly, but also something that may be a good deal harder to get a hold of if President Trump follows through with the tariff threats he's made against the European Union.
We've been taken advantage of for many, many years by countries, both friend and foe, and frankly, the friends have been worse than the foes in many cases.
A new deadline and a new threat. The U.S. could impose a 30% tariff on imported wine from the European Union if no deal is struck by August 1st.
We have worked and now are ready to respond with countermeasures.
It's been a mess.
In New York, importer Victor Schwartz has spent nearly 40 years supplying restaurants and wine shops with hand-picked bottles from small European vineyards. Now, tariffs threaten to upend the business.
20%, then it was 10%, then they threatened 50%.
How different is the effect on your business of a 20 versus a 10?
I mean, in our industry, end of the day, we might make 5% as a net profit, 5 to 10%. So obviously, we can't afford 10%. We can't afford 20%, but 20% is really egregious. 20%, I mean, think about what that does. God, it makes a $20 wine, $25 basically, because, there's kind of a multiplier effect as it goes through the system. It's a much bigger impact. And don't forget, when we raise a price, it's not as if the consumer just accepts it.
Where do American customers for wine go if they decide the price is too high? I'm not going to buy that.
Where are you going to find champagne? Where are you going to find Chateauneuf du Pape? Where are you going to find Chianti? You're not going to find it in Oregon or California. A Finger Lakes wine, let's just be clear, is nothing like a Napa Valley wine. Nothing like a wine from southern Italy or northern Italy or the center of Spain, etc. My gist is that these products are so connected to their place. And that's what's wonderful and interesting about wine. Otherwise, there'd be the wine company of the world, and it would come out of a spigot. Red, white, rosé, and sparkling. Done, right? But that's not why we love wine.
And Americans do love their wine. In 2023, we consumed just under 900 million gallons of it, more than any other country in the world, with a value of over $107 billion. More than a third of that is shipped in from abroad, making tariffs a real issue for importers. But those in the business say it's not just the imports that will be hit. It's the entire wine ecosystem. Ben Aniff is president of the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance. He has a shop in Tribeca that sells fine wine, which typically goes for over $20 per bottle.
Distributors and importers, even those, by the way, that represent U.S. domestic wines, about 75% of their revenue comes from imported wine. So that's one of the really interesting things about this. On the tariff front, all of the major domestic wine producing organizations, from Wine Institute to Napa Valley Vintners to Wine America, they're all against tariffs on imported wine because they understand their domestic growers, their producers, rely on healthy wine distributors for access to market.
Put another way, because state laws prevent domestic vineyards from supplying restaurants and wine shops, they need distributors. and the distributors rely critically on selling imports alongside their domestic wines. That's why those who import fine wines, like Victor Schwartz, and those who sell it to us, like Ben Aniff, have no doubt that tariffs will cripple their business, selling both foreign and domestic wines. But there's another part of the business, the value wine business, where a bottle or its equivalent typically costs less than $11. And producers for this segment, like Stuart Spencer in California's Central Valley, say they need protection from multinational companies bringing in cheap, subsidized imports that force American growers out of business.
There is a lot of what we call bulk wine coming in these big 20-foot bladder containers, and it is this bulk wine that is really undercutting California grape growers.
There's a lot of talk about the difference between free trade and fair trade. From your experience as a grower, but also from your dealing with Lodi, are there unfairnesses in some of the exports to the United States?
I mean, it's a completely unfair market. I mean, we are competing in a global marketplace. The European Union spends, over $2 billion a year between EU money and member state money propping up their wine sector. They are not only paying growers and vintners to distill excess wine and buy it up, but they're also paying them to plant new vineyards. And they spend hundreds of millions of dollars in market promotion all around the world, and the U.S. is the #1 target market. They also have trade barriers, so it gets really complex when you get in the weeds, but we are not playing on a level field.
Last year, California wineries, which make nearly 90% of U.S. wine, were stuck with more than 500,000 excess tons of grapes. Now, 77 million gallons of wine are sitting in storage tanks.
And you can still see some of the grapes on the vines from last year. We have thousands of acres of grapes that are being torn out right now. And we have small farms and family businesses that are up for sale because there's just not a prospect for them moving forward. My family's been in this for 50 years, and I talk to old timers that have been in it for multi-generations, and they've never seen it as challenging as we are now. 70% of all wine sales in this country is controlled by about a handful of 5 to 6 large multinational companies. They're bringing wine in bulk. They're blending it in with California wine up to 25% and calling it American appellation. It's a federal loophole. We have, millions of gallons filled up in tanks right now in California that don't have a home, but simultaneously 24 million gallons of bulk wine is poured into California, coming in at super low prices and undercutting the California grape grower.
Are you in favor of the tariffs that President Trump is talking about?
Well, I think if I was to speak to our 700 grape growers that I represent, I think many of them would support the tariffs to help level the playing field. And I think what we would really hope is that this would bring these other trading partners to the table to negotiate fair trade. The challenge we see with what's going on with a lot of the trade negotiations now is wine is just a pawn in a larger story, and the issues are about bigger issues. But I think none of us, want to see tariffs in place permanently. I think what we really want to see is really free and fair trade.
Some domestic producers, particularly in California, complain about unfairness from Europe because there are subsidies given to vineyards over in Europe. Are tariffs an effective way to deal with that problem?
I feel really bad for those guys, but a tariff is not going to solve their problem. Farmers that grow grapes to sell into, for instance, grocery store boxed wine, and that's terrific for them, it's a great product for certain customers. The demand for those products is collapsing. People aren't buying bulk wine the way they used to.
Whether tariffs could give some relief to bulk wine producers or not, they certainly would have unintended effects on the American economy overall. You have spent some of your time down in Washington trying to explain to lawmakers, policymakers, exactly what this would mean for the wine business. What would you want them to understand that maybe they don't understand right now about the business and the effects of tariffs?
The United States has been talking about their concerns with respect to a trade deficit. We import more European wines than we sell American wines to Europe, but the reality is we have a huge economic surplus on the sale of European wines in the United States. We import about $5.3 billion worth of wine from the European Union into the United States. But American businesses make almost $23 billion from the sale of those products. Making a big margin on wine for a restaurant, it is not a luxury. It is an absolute necessity for their very survival.
If, in fact, tariffs do get imposed, what are the likely long-term effects on the wine business?
Contraction. And then you know what that means. Contraction means American businesses closing and firing all of their employees.
What about the uncertainty itself, quite apart from the tariffs?
I mean, I'll tell you, I had phone calls from, wine distributors who said, my grandfather started this business. We were in terrific shape and growing and hiring in January. And now I might have to decide if I'm going to close the doors in 2 weeks. When they're put into this position, when their choice is either to pay a tariff that they cannot afford, because these are small businesses, or don't bring in wine. Don't bring in the wine that represents 75% of the revenue for your next 3 or 6 months. We had restaurants from South Florida say, in the summertime, we need Sancerre and Rosé. That's what keeps our businesses alive. And there really is no substitute for these products.
One of our favorite Riojas.
So in your wine store, you have Bordeaux. If you can't get the Bordeaux, will a customer say, that's okay, I'll take the cab?
The answer flatly is no.
We talk about terroir. It's a word that gets bandied about. It sounds fancy, it's foreign, but it really, all it means, terroir, land, terre, it just means the place, right? It's just geography. Part of terroir is the human element, the culture, the civilization, the people who've been on this piece of land in southern Italy for multiple generations. They cook certain kinds of food, they make certain kinds of wine that go with those foods, and it's very specific, right? I mean, don't you love to drink an Italian wine when you're having your spaghetti and meat sauce?
Schwartz is trying to hold off the administration as the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit challenging the tariffs. The U.S. Court of International Trade ruled in his favor, but the appeals court stayed the injunction to give itself time to hear the case. If the tariffs go into effect for European wines, August 1, how long will it take before we see it in our lives?
I think you'll start to see it pretty quickly. The first tariffed wines have only now started to come in. So distributors have still been selling through some wines that didn't have tariffs on them. You're going to start seeing those prices come now. You're going to start seeing a lot less choice. There are importers and distributors that have halted all of their shipments because they're not sure they can afford to bring them in. Now, at the same time, they have no substitutes for them. They're not buying more domestic wine, for instance. They can't afford to. They need to sell these European wines in order to buy more American wine. And in a nutshell, American businesses are incredibly good at selling European wine, and they support huge numbers of jobs in the United States. Some of the most famous importers actually got into the business because they were in France or Italy during World War II, said, oh my God, I love this. This is what I want to do with my life. And they're classic American entrepreneurial success stories. As a matter of fact, many of the most famous European wines in the world, they're famous today because they were discovered by American wine importers. And they were brought back. They tasted 10,000 wines, said, these 3 are the best, and they were right. Funny story, one of the first guys to do that, by the way, was Thomas Jefferson. He went to Burgundy, he bought Montrachet and Merceau-Côte d'Or for he and George Washington. He bought Chateau d'Yquem for he and George Washington. And today, those are still some of the greatest wines on the planet. He had a pretty good palate, I think.
And now, ironically, Americans' affinity for European wines nurtured by the likes of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson may be challenged by the most recent occupant of their high office, and perhaps make it more difficult for us to enjoy that bottled poetry they discovered 250 years ago in fine French wines. Up next, from our wrists to our fingers, everyone seems to be wearing some device to monitor how healthy our habits are. We visit the wonderful world of Whoop to see what's really possible. This is a story about the fountain of youth. Since long before Ponce de Leon supposedly got lost looking for it in the swamps of Florida in 1513, humans have been on a quest for a longer and healthier life, leading to everything from exercise regimens to diet crazes to weight loss drugs. Now, as in everything else, big tech is in the game. But are elaborate wellness devices really worth it? Or does the path to longevity boil down to just a few fundamental principles?
Wearable technology and the sensors that we have today will continue to unlock new capabilities.
Eventually, we will arrive to a point where we can really monitor our processes and intervene early on before a disease could develop.
When you wear something on your body, it starts to say a lot about who you are.
We think that wearables are a key to the MAHA agenda, making America healthy again. And we are going to, my vision is that every American is wearing a wearable within 4 years.
Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s goal might seem ambitious, but the market for global wellness wearables is on the rise. Data firm IDC expects global revenues to grow from $63 billion last year to nearly $78 billion by 2029.
With wearable technology, you need to build something that's either cool or invisible, we like to say.
Will Ahmed is the founder and CEO of Whoop, one of the major players in the wellness wearable field. As of its last funding round in 2021, it was valued at $3.6 billion. Will first came up with the idea during his time as captain of Harvard's squash team.
Whoop builds wearable technology that's really designed to improve performance and health. The company was founded out of the Harvard Innovation Lab 12 years ago. We started with the world's best athletes, where we were really designing high-performance technology to replace what at the time was a lot of medical technology. An electrocardiogram, a PSG machine, the gold standard for sleep, a chest strap, which measures heart rate during exercise. This is the original prototype that we built in 2012. Now, it looks ridiculous in a million ways, but it could measure this thing called heart rate variability from the wrist, which was a breakthrough. We wanted to take these sophisticated but antiquated pieces of technology and put them in a much smaller form factor. And the business has really evolved quite beautifully from being a very high-performance athletic product to now being a tool that many people are using to live longer.
While wellness wearables today are heavily focused on new technology that can measure heart health, it was more than 100 years ago when the idea for the pedometer was first patented. Polar raised the stakes in the 80s with the first wireless heart rate monitor, but it was Fitbit in the early 2000s that took the industry mainstream. Today, the wellness wearables arena is crowded, attracting billions in investment and spawning new startups regularly.
Wearables today are nearly ubiquitous. I think certainly when I go out and about, I do see people with an Apple Watch, a Whoop, an Aura. We do see people wearing with various devices out in the world today.
Alex Morgan is a partner in Khosla Ventures, where he focuses on investment in emerging biotech, healthcare, and data science.
For many wearables, the competitive landscape is a challenge. We certainly saw in some of the first generation of activity-based wearables that were many companies that were all measuring activity and heart rate, and it was very hard to compete with a product that really didn't provide unique information, and it was much more about brand and packaging and perhaps influencer. And there are ways that you can win in a competitive landscape with better branding, better marketing, better access to influencers. We tend to look for technology that is unique, often protectable with IP, that offers unique benefit, and that is something that we particularly look for.
Samsung recently released the Galaxy Watch 8, offering new health tracking capabilities. In late 2024, Apple announced its latest smartwatch with advanced features like a sleep apnea detector. But not every company is successful. Amazon discontinued its Halo fitness band in 2023, underscoring the challenge of entering this market without a clear edge. With multiple devices to choose from, how does one brand set itself apart from the pack? Wearables have become popular in various ways. How do you compare? What's your market niche?
So we've designed the product to be worn very easily in whatever location you want. And what does that ultimately achieve? Well, it achieves a solution where you can be collecting this health data 24/7. And continuous data is ultimately what makes our tool so successful. You know, a real challenge, I think, with other products that came before Whoop is they would give you these sort of snapshots along the way. We collect an enormous amount of data on the human body, physiological data. It's really accurate. We've tuned the sensors to be really accurate. But what that also means is we're not going to do 1,000 other things, right? We're not a smartwatch. We're not doing phone calls. You're not going to call an Uber with your Whoop. But at the end of the day, we don't spend that much time thinking about competition. We're just incredibly focused on how do we drive health outcomes.
So how does a wearable company help drive health outcomes? For Whoop, it's about differentiating itself through technology, using sophisticated biometric monitoring and data collection for more actionable health insights. Its most recent models are the Whoop 5.0 and Whoop MG.
It's got a 14-day battery life. It's got more accurate sensing. The Whoop MG has medical clearances, so it's able to do ECG monitoring, AFib detection, blood pressure insights. So these are all really powerful innovations that, frankly, just didn't exist.
Whatever wearable technology is doing to measure or interact with an individual, the accelerating ability of AI and machine learning to improve the capability of that measurement or that intervention is only accelerating. We are translating to a phase where there are wearable technologies that aren't just providing insights, but actually providing interventions. They're actually therapeutic in some way. And I think that is going to accelerate the current adoption even more. Because I do think that most people, most customers, don't necessarily want insights. Most people want solutions to problems that they have, whether it's problems sleeping, problems with depression, concerns about weight.
Wellness wearables have certainly become popular, but are they a good business? And what takes a wearable from being a nice to have to being a have to have?
When we evaluate a company, there's no single way we evaluate it. So sometimes we invest in unique technology. And that's actually the majority of my time, trying to identify unique technology that is crossing over into being productizable and translatable into products that we believe will provide real value to customers and patients. And that's, I think, one of the first things we want to do. Is this product or technology really able to help people in a potentially powerful way? Another technology that I'm really excited about that's being used is a company called Flow Neuroscience. So this is on the market in the UK and Europe. Over 10,000 people a month use it. And it also uses a gentle electric stimulation to treat mild to moderate depression and general anxiety disorder. Numerous clinical trials have shown benefit. So in some of the more recent clinical trials, about 16% improvement in remission in depressive symptoms compared to 20% in placebo. So the ideal startup for us is a technology that provides unique, powerful patient and customer benefit in some way. They're able to say, here's an innovation in technology that is crossing over from basic science and research and moving into an opportunity to go out and help many people that have a particular problem, and able to do that in a unique and special way. Certainly, there are people using things like continuous glucose monitoring that you may not know that they're using, but if you ask someone with diabetes, that is probably how they may be managing it today if you're insulin-dependent diabetic. So I would say that it has crossed the chasm into being something that's speculative, into being a product that's just part of the everyday lives for many Americans.
We're now in 50 markets. I think one of the biggest changes for Whoop in the last 2 years is going from being almost entirely a U.S. business to being a global business. That obviously introduces new challenges, but also enormous growth. And so we've seen the business growing considerably in the last 12 months, 70% year-over-year growth, which is really exciting.
We don't have the data yet to show that wearables like Whoop will actually make us healthier, much less live longer. And some believe the path to the fountain of youth ultimately means doing the things our mothers have taught us through the generations.
The secret of healthy life is very simple, and it doesn't require an industry to maintain it. Ignore all that noise and focus on these 5 fundamental components, from diet to exercise, stress, sleep, and so on.
Albert Laszlo Barabasi is a network science physicist. He believes wearables may help users stay healthy, but there's no secret about the keys to success.
As long as you focus on these basics and you make sure that these are guaranteed, you are actually setting yourself up for a healthy lifestyle. Everything else is more or less an intervention that is trying to correct a problem because these have not been properly observed. Certainly, having access to all the data points about us does give us a sense of control. And I think that sense of control fails when we realize that we don't know how to correct that. And we all gonna encounter that moment in our lives where the numbers are flashing and showing that something is out of balance.
Where do wearables need to go from here if they're to become proactive health companions? Not surprisingly, artificial intelligence may be part of the answer.
We've used artificial intelligence for a decade to really improve our algorithms for sensing. And the result, I think, is being able to demonstrate in the market we're the most performance product. We still have the world's best athletes that wear Whoop. We have medically approved features. And we have consumers that swear by our accuracy. You don't really get those combination of things if the underlying data isn't really good.
Eventually, we will arrive to a point where we can really monitor our processes and intervene early on before a disease could develop. One way to think about it is that every single disease that I will have throughout my lifetime is already within me developing, because I already born with all the mutations and all the defects that will eventually just develop themselves and manifest themselves with age. And the question is, how can we capture that early and how can correct that before it's too late? And in that respect, wearable technologies as well as the many monitoring devices that the technology is making possible eventually will be the answer. Are they the answer right now? Not necessarily.
We are translating to a phase where there are wearable technologies that aren't just providing insights, but actually providing interventions. They're actually therapeutic in some way.
If we look at the next few years, right? Health monitoring will start by enabling individuals and being kind of a continuation of that doctor's office. And I think in the long run, it'll ultimately replace the doctor's office.
At the point where wearables can replace our visits to the doctor, or even make those visits a bit less frequent, they will truly move from the nice to the necessary for us all. And that could lead to a sort of technological fountain of youth, found not in the swamps of Florida, but right on your wrist. Coming up, some of us may be worried about artificial intelligence coming for our jobs. But does that include all those economists at the Federal Reserve? That's next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about an invisible hand guiding the economy. No, not the invisible hand of self-interest that Adam Smith wrote about in The Wealth of Nations. This invisible hand is much more modern. It's that artificial intelligence we keep hearing so much about. Our special contributor, Larry Summers, is a macroeconomist who also sits on the board of OpenAI. Who better to ask what AI could mean for Adam Smith's economy?
My guess is that this is going to raise the neutral rate of interest over time, both because of the massive investment that's going to need to take place in data centers and because of the acceleration in the rate of growth. So I think the so-called R star is likely to be higher, perhaps even considerably higher, because of AI. I think it's possible that it's going to be a disinflationary force because of acceleration of productivity growth, as the internet was during the 1990s.
The economic potential of AI varies widely, with some saying that it can disrupt jobs, whole industries, and even pose existential challenges.
It's not yet like replacing jobs in the way, or to the degree that people thought it was going to. Of course, jobs will change, and of course, some jobs will totally go away.
It really is an existential threat. Some people say this is just science fiction, and until fairly recently, I believed it was a long way off. Now I think it's quite likely that sometime in the next 20 years, these things will get smarter than us, and we really need to worry about what happens then.
So let me ask about one particular, perhaps rule of thumb or rule, and that is the relationship between inflation on the one hand and unemployment on the other, which has been an important issue for the Federal Reserve, for example, with its dual mandate to address both of those. Do you think it could change that relationship?
It certainly could, and you can make arguments in both directions. Perhaps the more flexible economy means that rates of inflation or prices will be more sensitive to demand and unemployment than they were before. Perhaps the more rapid underlying productivity growth will mean that there's less sensitivity, because when there's an increase in demand, the economy will be able to accommodate it more easily because there's more capacity fundamentally in the economy. I think it's difficult to know, and if I had to guess, the effects that I described on the neutral interest rate and so forth are probably going to be more salient than any change in the slope of the Phillips curve of that relationship you referred to between inflation and unemployment. But nobody can be confident in their judgments about this kind of thing.
There's the uncertainty about what AI could mean for the economy, but there are also questions about what it could mean for central banks trying to set monetary policy and how it could change the way they gather and analyze data about the economy. Sasha Stefan of the Frankfurt School of Finance has studied the ways AI might change monetary policy transmission.
Specifically, and this is also the most common or most natural thing people are thinking about here, is it will improve forecasting. And I think this is sort of where everybody's interested. How are interest rates going? How does the economy develop going forward? How is inflation going forward? So here we're going to see a lot already happening in terms of AI. And I think here there's also a lot to learn going forward.
Is it likely to make forecasting more accurate, do you think?
I think definitely. So I think one dimension of AI is basically increasing the toolbox and the methodologies, improving on the methodologies, thereby also making forecasting much more precise. Also basically using models to use existing data and use them in completely novel ways, right? So how can we use bond market data? How can we use loan market data? So we can employ these models to look at things that we haven't been able to do before. We can look at websites. We can use images from satellites. We can use social media, right? So actually I have a study, a recent one, in which we try to use AI and Twitter, or X, in order to generate an index about what do individuals, like households, have an idea about how inflation is going to develop going forward. Right? So this is what we call inflation expectations. And this is something where central banks, the Federal Reserve, but also the European central banks are looking much more closely at compared to what we call like realized inflation, what we have. So what do actually people, households expect in terms of inflation going forward? Because this is going to affect how they're going to behave. What kinds of products are they going to buy? What kinds of sort of how they're going to save going forward. And also firms are going to be affected by that because they see if customers don't buy, the shelves are going to remain full, and they basically report a completely different bottom or top line going forward.
What are the risks of expanding out the data that way? I mean, large language models by and large are based on what human beings have generated, and human beings are not perfect. And you can get hallucinations that way. What are the risks, particularly as you go to things like social media, for example, X?
Information sensitivity is always run, right? Which means that if new information arises, that can cause maybe a complete meltdown of the market. Stocks are going to be sold. And of course, AI makes it even more likely that these risks are actually, or these new information is actually going to emerge. Right? But also another risk is, for example, interconnectedness. And AI also will connect institutions more going forward. There might be shared data, there might be shared platforms that might increase interconnectedness. So if one domino drops, the others might actually drop as well. So amplification of existing risks is definitely one problem. Another problem that's very frequently mentioned if you talk to practitioners in this field is also a kind of what we call model bias, right? So what happens if we use data that has been generated by a model that has already been false to begin with, and then we continue to use that data going forward? There will be so-called like perpetuation of these biases going forward, and like garbage in, garbage out.
We hear from some experts in AI that we're getting to a point, maybe past a point, where we don't actually know how it works. It's a black box in that sense. Yeah. If that's true, How can a central bank rely on it? How can it verify it or certify it to make sure that it's making correct inferences?
That's an absolute important point. This is, on the one hand, this is definitely a risk, right? Because if things go wrong, the trust that might be there quickly goes away, and then the things might even be worse going forward. One of the potential powerful applications of AI for central banks is to not replace necessarily, but to complement the professional forecasting that the central banks usually rely on. They usually do, on a quarterly basis, ask a lot of professionals and investment banks and other institutions as to what do they expect the economy to develop going forward, specifically when it comes to inflation. And now it might be actually possible to set up an AI model that exactly does that. So it basically is trained on the individual. It's trained on the CVs of the professional forecasters, how they have actually voted or what they have done in previous forecasts that they did, what is their job, what they learned, and then asked the model instead of the forecaster. And the existing research already tells us that there's a high degree of overlap in terms of what the professional forecast actually would tell him or herself and what the model actually sells, right? But then the one risk, and now coming back to your question, is that how can we actually make sure that the model actually uses only the information that is available at the time of the forecast itself, or is it trained basically on information that it should not know because it actually happened afterwards?
Well, I wonder about the systemic risk, because not being a computer science, it's possible that AI could spot relationships that otherwise humans might miss. I mean, so you have something like Silicon Valley Bank in the United States. Is it possible AI would have spotted imbalances earlier that humans missed?
Specifically with Silicon Valley Bank, it would have recognized this, because it's also interesting that people did not realize this because it was obvious, to be clear, because actually all the publicly available data was pointing exactly at that. But no, you're absolutely right. So these kind of systemically important banks, also other banks, risks emerging based on, for example, liquidity consideration might be detected much, much earlier compared to what a regulator or supervisor might actually see.
And will we need human beings, economists presumably, to check what's going on to make corrections? Because you can have hallucinations in any model, and if you don't correct them, as I understand it, they just compound.
I think this is exactly one danger, that people might actually try to and rely on AI and these models too much and think, okay, these models actually know what's going to happen. But the idea how to assess these outcomes or these outputs, that is a crucial one. And this means, I think also for us as not only as economists, but also as educators, we need to make sure that people understand the underlying theory and economics actually in order to evaluate, is that what the model actually tells me? Is it something that's actually plausible or something that's not, right? So I think this puts a lot of pressure on us also as educators, but then also on the different institutions. Do they actually train the people right going forward?
That does it for us here at Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. See you next week for more stories of capitalism.